He believed the world had taken everything from him, and so he stood in the quiet judgment of his barn, ready to give it the last thing he had left. But then, from the shadows of the hayloft above, a sound he could not have imagined, a whisper that would change not one life but 6. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The rope felt coarse and final in Elias's hands. Its fibers were a litany of every failure, every lost crop, every prayer that had turned to dust in his throat. He ran a thumb over the braid, feeling the splinters catch on the calloused map of his skin. This barn, his father's barn, had always been a place of life. The scent of sweet hay, the lowing of cattle, the metallic tang of fresh milk in a pail. Now, it smelled only of decay and memory. Dust motes danced like frantic ghosts in the single shaft of late afternoon sun piercing the gloom, each one a tiny, insignificant life flitting through the air, more alive than he felt. He looked up at the main support beam, thick and dark as a gallows tree. It had held the weight of this roof for 50 years. It could certainly hold the weight of one man's sorrow. His movements were slow, deliberate, a ritual of surrender. There was no rage left in him, no searing anger at the sky for its lack of rain or at the bank for its lack of mercy. There was only a profound, hollow emptiness, a silence that had started in his heart the day he buried Martha and had since consumed everything else. He remembered her hands, how they could coax life from the most stubborn soil, how they felt clasped in his as they stood on the porch, dreaming of the children they would have, the legacy they would build. The legacy was now just this, a failing farm, a mountain of debt, and a silence so complete it roared in his ears. He tossed the end of the rope over the beam. It landed with a soft, definitive thud on the other side, sending up a puff of dust that shimmered in the light. He began to fashion the knot, his fingers moving with a grim muscle memory from his long-gone days as a sailor. A hangman's noose. 13 wraps. Unlucky for some. For him, it felt like a key, a final, merciful exit from a room with no doors. He pulled it tight, testing the strength of his own handiwork. The world outside had ceased to matter. The chirping of crickets, the distant crow of a rooster, the rustle of the wind through the dead corn stalks. It was all a symphony for other men, for the living. For him, there was only this beam, this rope, this final, quiet decision. He dragged a heavy wooden crate beneath the beam, the sound of it scraping against the dirt floor, a violation of the tomb-like stillness. He stepped onto it, his boots unsteady, his body feeling alien and heavy. He reached for the noose, his shadow long and distorted on the barn wall, a silent witness to his last act. He was ready. He closed his eyes, picturing Martha's face, hoping she would be the first thing he saw on the other side. And in that moment, from the deep shadows of the hayloft directly above him, a sound broke the stillness. It was not the wind. It was not a rat. It was small, terrified, and unmistakably human. A whisper, carried on the dust motes. "Sir," Elias froze, his hand hovering inches from the rope. The voice was a ghost, a trick of a mind strained to its breaking point. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing it away, a hallucination born of grief and isolation. But it came again, clearer this time, a thread of sound in the oppressive silence. "Sir, please don't." It was the voice of a child, plural. There was a soft rustle, the sound of shifting straw, and then another whisper joined the first, smaller, more fragile. He opened his eyes, tilting his head back slowly, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He saw nothing but the dark, crisscrossing timbers of the loft and the deep blackness between them. The sunbeam had shifted, leaving him almost entirely in shadow. For a moment he thought he had truly gone mad. The silence had become so loud it was inventing voices to fill the void. He was a man talking to himself, hearing children who weren't there. He let out a breath, a ragged, bitter laugh that sounded more like a sob. Of course, the final cruelty of a cruel God, to make him think for one fleeting second that he was not alone. He reached for the rope again, his resolve hardening. This was just another phantom, another memory twisting itself into a new and painful shape. But then, a pair of eyes blinked open in the darkness above, and then another pair, and another. wide, white, and staring down at him with an intensity that rooted him to the crate. They were real. They were impossibly, terrifyingly real. Slowly, a small, dark face emerged from the hay, then a second and a third, until 5 small faces peered down from the edge of the loft, their expressions a mixture of profound fear and a strange, desperate courage. They were black children, none of them older than 12, all of them thin and clad in ragged clothes that blended into the shadows. Their presence was an explosion in his silent world, a tear in the fabric of his carefully constructed despair. Who were they? How had they gotten here? The questions flooded his mind, pushing back the fog of his own grim intentions. The crate beneath his feet suddenly felt precarious, no longer a pedestal for his demise, but a clumsy, foolish perch. The rope dangling beside his head seemed obscene, a grotesque tool of a madness he was only now beginning to comprehend. The eldest, a boy with eyes that held the gravity of a man twice his age, was the one who had spoken. He didn't speak again, merely held Elias's gaze, his small shoulders squared with a protective defiance. The other 4, 2 boys and 2 girls, huddled behind him, their faces a mosaic of tear-streaked dust and terror. They were like a clutch of frightened sparrows, discovered in their nest by a hawk. And in that moment, looking up at them, Elias felt a strange and unwelcome emotion stir in the pit of his stomach. Shame. A hot, creeping shame that had nothing to do with his debt or his failed crops, but everything to do with the rope in his hand, and the sight of these 5 children witnessing the absolute nadir of his existence. He had been so lost in the cathedral of his own suffering that he had not noticed the silent congregation hiding in the rafters. He slowly, deliberately, lowered his hand from the rope. The gesture felt monumental, as if he were lowering a weapon in a truce. He stepped down from the crate, his knees weak, the ground feeling solid and unfamiliar beneath his boots. The barn, which moments ago had been his chosen tomb, was now a charged, tense space, humming with the presence of these unexpected lives. He didn't know what to say. The part of him that knew how to speak to people, to children, had been buried with Martha. All he had left were grunts and silence. He cleared his throat, the sound loud and abrasive. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice a rusty hinge. The words hung in the air, heavy and useless. The children didn't answer. They just watched him, their collective gaze a physical weight. The eldest boy, the one who had spoken, pulled one of the younger girls slightly further behind him, a small, protective gesture that spoke volumes. Elias saw the fear in their eyes, and he realized with a jolt that their fear was not just of the stranger they saw below, but of him, specifically, of a white man, in a barn with a rope. The context of their world, a world he had long tried to ignore, rushed in on him. To them, he was not a grieving farmer at the end of his tether. He was a threat, an owner of this space, a potential source of unimaginable violence. This realization was a second, sharper shame. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he mumbled, the words feeling clumsy and false in his own ears. Why should they believe him? He had just been about to commit the ultimate act of violence against himself. What did his assurance mean? He took a half-step toward the ladder that led to the loft, and the children flinched back as one, a ripple of terror that stopped him cold. He held up his hands, palms out, an instinctive gesture of peace. "Stay there," he said, his voice softer this time. "Just stay there." He backed away, putting distance between himself and them, retreating toward the massive barn doors. He needed air. He needed to think. His mind, so recently placid and resolved in its singular dark purpose, was now a maelstrom. These children were a problem he did not want. They were fugitives of some kind, that much was clear. Hiding in his barn meant they were running from someone, and in this part of the country, for children like them, that someone was likely the law, or worse. Harboring them was a risk, a dangerous, stupid risk for a man who had nothing left to lose, and yet, paradoxically, everything to lose if the sheriff came sniffing around. He could throw them out. It would be the sensible thing to do. Tell them to move on, to find another barn, another hiding place. It wasn't his concern. He had his own ghosts to wrestle. He could go back to the rope. He could pretend he never saw them. But the image of their faces, their wide, terrified eyes, was now burned into his mind, and a memory, unwanted and sharp, pierced through the fog. Martha, standing on their porch, handing a cool glass of water to a black field hand who was passing by on the road. The man had been hesitant, surprised. Sheriff Miller had driven by moments later, giving them a long, hard stare. Elias had been nervous, angry even. "You shouldn't do that, Martha," he'd said later. "People talk." She had just looked at him with those clear, honest eyes of hers. "He was thirsty, Elias," she'd said, as if it were the simplest, most obvious thing in the world, as if kindness required no further justification. The memory was a rebuke. He looked from the barn door back toward the dark loft. He was thirsty too, not for water but for an end, and these children, with a single whispered plea, had offered him a drink. The heavy thud of a fist on the barn door sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through him. It was a sound he knew well, the sound of authority. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. He shot a look up at the loft. In the dim light he could just make out the children, frozen like statues, their eyes wide with a new and more immediate terror. "Elias, you in there?" The voice was unmistakable. Sheriff Miller, a man whose joviality was as thin as a coat of cheap paint over rotting wood. Miller's presence was rarely a good thing, and today it felt like a death knell. Elias moved to the door, his mind racing. He had to appear normal, unbothered. He had to erase the last hour from his face. He pulled the large door open just a crack, squinting into the bright, unforgiving sunlight. The sheriff stood there, his bulk filling the frame, his uniform sweating in the heat, a nickel-plated star pinned to his chest. "Sheriff," Elias said, his voice flat. Miller's eyes, small and shrewd, swept past Elias, trying to peer into the barn's gloom. "Just making my rounds, Elias. Heard things are tough." It wasn't a question of concern, it was an assessment, a predator testing for weakness. "Things are what they are," Elias replied, keeping his body positioned to block the view. Miller's gaze lingered on Elias's face. "You look like you've seen a ghost, son." Elias's throat went dry. The irony was a bitter pill. "Just tired." The sheriff grunted, not buying it but not pressing. He shifted his weight, his holster creaking. "Listen, reason I'm out this way. Old man Abernathy over at the plantation claims a few of his hands took off last night. Took some food with them. Said they were just children. Can you believe it? Ungrateful is what it is." He spat a stream of tobacco juice near Elias's boot. "Seen anything unusual? Anyone passing through?" Elias's world narrowed to that single question. Behind him, in the shadows, 5 lives hung in the balance. Every instinct of self-preservation screamed at him to say no, to say nothing, to close the door and let the sheriff move on. It was the easy path, the safe path. To invite Miller's suspicion was to invite ruin. They could take his farm, they could run him out of the county, they could do worse. He was already a man on the edge. He didn't need a push from the law. But then, he thought of the whisper, "Please don't." It wasn't a plea to save them. It was a plea to save himself. He felt the weight of their gaze from the loft, a silent, desperate appeal. He thought of Martha's simple, defiant kindness. He looked Sheriff Miller straight in the eye, the lie forming on his tongue. It was a small thing, a few simple words, but it felt like shifting the foundations of his world. "Haven't seen a soul," Elias said, his voice steady, betraying none of the chaos inside him. "Been in here all afternoon. Just me and the dust." Miller's eyes narrowed, searching Elias's face for a flicker of deceit. For a long moment the only sound was the wind rattling the tin roof. Elias held his breath, expecting the accusation, the shove, the search. But the sheriff just grunted again, seemingly satisfied. "All right then. Well, you keep an eye out. They're just kids, but Abernathy's offering a reward. A man could use that these days." He gave Elias a final dismissive look and turned away, his boots crunching on the dry earth as he walked back to his vehicle. Elias watched him go, not moving, not breathing, until the sound of the engine faded into the distance. Only then did he slide the heavy door shut, plunging the barn back into near darkness. He leaned his forehead against the rough wood, his body trembling with the aftermath of the lie. He had chosen. He had lied for them. And in doing so, he had tethered his fate, however short it might be, to the 5 frightened children hiding in his hay. The silence that returned to the barn was different now. It was no longer the hollow silence of despair, but a shared, fragile quiet, thick with unspoken questions. Elias stood with his back to the door for a long time, letting the tremor in his hands subside. The lie he had told the sheriff felt like a stone dropped into the still pool of his life, and the ripples were only just beginning to spread. He had crossed a line, not just with the law, but with himself. The man who had been ready to end everything just a short while ago had just risked what little he had left for 5 strangers. He didn't understand it. He didn't know why. He only knew that when the moment came, he could not bring himself to betray the whisper from the hayloft. He turned and walked slowly toward the center of the barn. The rope still hung from the beam, a silent, grim accusation. Without looking at it, he reached up, untied the knot he had so carefully fashioned, and let the rope fall to the dirt floor. It coiled there like a dead snake. He kicked it into a dark corner, out of sight. His gaze lifted to the loft. "He's gone," he said, his voice quiet but carrying in the stillness. There was a long pause, then the slow, cautious rustle of hay. The face of the eldest boy appeared again at the edge, his eyes still wary, but the sharp edge of terror had been replaced by a sliver of something else: confusion, curiosity, perhaps even a microscopic grain of trust. Elias walked to the old water pump in the corner, the one he hadn't used in months. He worked the handle, the rusty mechanism groaning in protest until a trickle of cool, clean water sputtered from the spout. He filled a dented tin cup, the one Martha used for watering her porch flowers, and set it on the bottom rung of the ladder. "Water," he said. It was an offering, a truce. He backed away, giving them space, and sat down on an overturned bucket, his back against a support post. He watched as the boy, after a moment's hesitation, shimmied down the ladder with a nimbleness that spoke of practice. He snatched the cup, his movements quick and furtive, like a fox raiding a henhouse. He drank deeply, then climbed back up to pass it to the others. Elias could hear their soft, grateful murmurs, the sound of them sharing the small measure of relief he had provided. He then remembered the half-loaf of stale bread on a shelf in his tack room, wrapped in a cloth. It was meant to be his own meager supper. He retrieved it, along with a small bruised apple he'd found on the ground by the withered orchard, and placed them beside the ladder. He didn't say a word, just returned to his bucket and waited. The boy came down again, this time a little less hesitantly. He took the food, and for the first time, he looked directly at Elias and gave a short, sharp nod. It wasn't thanks. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition of the pact that had been silently forged between them. For the next hour, they existed in this strange, quiet communion. Elias on his bucket, the children hidden in their nest of hay. The sun sank lower, casting long, distorted shadows across the barn floor. The world was still broken. His farm was still failing. His grief was still a heavy cloak on his shoulders. But something had shifted. The crushing weight of his solitude had been lifted, replaced by the weight of this new, terrifying responsibility. He was no longer just a man waiting to die. He was a guardian, a liar, a protector. He had a secret to keep. The boy's name was Samuel. He learned this not because the boy told him, but because he heard one of the younger girls whisper it in the dark, her voice laced with a plea for reassurance. Samuel. It was a good, strong name, a prophet's name. Elias watched him, the de facto leader of this small, fugitive flock, and saw a resilience that shamed his own surrender. The boy's eyes, ancient and weary, held a spark Elias thought he had long since extinguished in himself. It was the spark of survival. As twilight bled through the cracks in the barn walls, painting the dusty air in shades of purple and gray, a memory unspooled in Elias's mind, sharp and unwelcome. It wasn't of Martha this time. It was from long before her, from his youth, a memory he had buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself it was a bad dream. He was a boy of 16, standing with his father and a group of other white men, their faces illuminated by torchlight. They were on the edge of the Miller property, not the sheriff's family, but their cousins, who owned the next largest plot of land. They were there for a dispute over a fence line with their neighbor, a black farmer named Josiah, a freedman who had managed to buy his own small patch of earth through sheer will and backbreaking labor. Josiah's farm was thriving in a way theirs was not, and Elias's father, a man of bitter pride and easy cruelty, could not stand it. Elias remembered the smell of whiskey on their breath, the self-righteous anger in their voices. He remembered Josiah standing on his porch, unarmed, his wife and 2 small children behind him, their faces pale with fear in the flickering light. His father had done the talking, his voice dripping with condescension and menace. Josiah had not backed down. He had stood his ground, speaking of deeds and property lines with a quiet dignity that only enraged the mob further. Elias remembered what happened next. The pushing, the shoving, the first stone thrown. He remembered his own role in it, a silent, cowardly bystander, paralyzed by fear of his father, his inaction a form of consent. He didn't throw a stone, but he didn't stop one either. The night ended with Josiah's fence torn down, his prize bull mysteriously lamed, and his spirit, though not his dignity, bruised and battered. They had called it teaching him a lesson. Elias had felt sick for a week, a sour guilt churning in his gut. Years later, Josiah's farm failed. The lamed bull, the constant harassment, the poisoned well of community prejudice. It was too much. He and his family had simply vanished one night, slipped away like ghosts, leaving everything behind. Elias never knew where they went. He just knew a deep, abiding shame had taken root in him that day, a shame he had never spoken of, not even to Martha. Looking up at the hayloft, at the 5 small dark faces peering down at him, he saw the ghosts of Josiah's children. He saw the direct line from that torch-lit night of his youth to this twilight moment in his barn. The world that had allowed him and his father to terrorize a family with impunity was the same world that had forced these 5 children to flee into the night and seek refuge in the barn of a man who, by all rights, they should fear. The irony was a physical blow. He had been complicit in the very system of fear and injustice that had created these young fugitives. His despair, his grief over Martha, his failed farm, it all suddenly seemed like a self-indulgent misery in the face of their silent, terrified flight. He had felt that the world had been unjust to him, but what justice had he ever offered the world? The rope in the corner was no longer just a tool of his own escape. It was a symbol of his cowardice, of his long, silent complicity. These children, by their very presence, were holding up a mirror to his soul, and he did not like the man he saw reflected there. A small cough from the hayloft, dry and rasping, broke his reverie. It was one of the younger children, a little girl no older than 6. The sound was weak, fragile. It was the sound of sickness. Elias stood up, the stiffness in his bones a reminder of how long he had been sitting. He walked to the ladder. "I'm coming up," he said, his voice low and even. "I'm not going to hurt you. One of you is sick." He didn't wait for permission, knowing that any hesitation on his part would only increase their fear. He began to climb, the wooden rungs creaking under his weight. As his head cleared the floor of the loft, he saw them huddled together in the far corner, a tight knot of fear. Samuel stood in front, his small body a barricade. The little girl who had coughed was curled behind him, her breathing shallow. Elias stopped, keeping his distance, letting them see his empty hands. The loft smelled of old hay and fear. "She needs water," Elias said, looking past Samuel to the girl. "And food. Proper food." Samuel just stared, his jaw tight. He did not trust this man, this sudden, strange benefactor. The lie to the sheriff was one thing. This intrusion into their sanctuary was another. "We're fine," Samuel said, his voice a boy's voice trying to sound like a man's. Elias's gaze softened. He saw not defiance but desperation. "Son," he said, the word feeling foreign on his tongue, "you've done a good job keeping them safe. A fine job. But you can't do it all alone." He slowly sank to his haunches, making himself smaller, less threatening. "Let me help. My wife, Martha, she was good with sickness. I watched her. I learned a few things." The mention of his wife, of her name spoken aloud in this space, sent a pang through his chest. But it also seemed to lower the temperature in the loft. It made him a person, a man who had loved someone, not just a looming threat. He saw a flicker of uncertainty in Samuel's eyes. The little girl coughed again, a weak, rattling sound that tore at Elias's heart. He knew that cough. It was the kind that could settle in the chest and turn deadly. especially in a child weakened by hunger and exhaustion. He made a decision. Without another word, he backed away and climbed down the ladder. He strode out of the barn and into the house, a place he had avoided as much as possible, a museum of his grief. Dust lay thick on every surface. Martha's rocking chair sat silent by the cold hearth. He ignored it all, heading straight for the kitchen. He found what he was looking for in the pantry: a jar of peaches Martha had canned 2 summers ago, a bag of cornmeal, the last of the salted bacon. He worked with a purpose he hadn't felt in a year. He built a small fire in the stove, the smoke a welcome sign of life in the dead house. He cooked the bacon, filling the kitchen with a rich, savory smell. He made a thin, warm gruel from the cornmeal, sweetening it with the syrup from the peaches. The acts were simple, domestic, and profoundly healing. He was tending, he was nurturing, he was doing the things he and Martha had done together, the rituals that build a home. As he worked, he glanced out the dirty kitchen window at his farm. The cracked earth, the withered stalks of corn, it all looked the same. But he saw it differently now. He saw a small patch of green near the well, a stubborn weed that had found enough moisture to survive, a single defiant shoot pushing its way toward the sun. He had been so focused on the dust that he hadn't noticed it. Hope, he realized, was a stubborn thing. He carried the food to the barn on a wooden tray, the warm gruel, the crispy bacon, the sweet peaches in a bowl. He set it at the base of the ladder. This time he didn't retreat. He just stood there, waiting. After a moment, Samuel came down, followed by the others. They were drawn by the smell, by a need that was greater than their fear. They ate. They devoured the food with a silent, desperate hunger, their small hands shaking slightly. For the first time, Elias saw them not as a problem or a risk, but simply as they were, hungry children. And he was the man who was feeding them. The next 2 days passed in a strange, secret rhythm. By day, the children were ghosts, silent and invisible in the hayloft, while Elias performed the motions of his solitary life, a constant fear of the sheriff's return a knot in his stomach. He'd walk the perimeter of his property, his eyes scanning the dusty road for any sign of a vehicle, his ears straining for any sound that was out of place. He became a sentry at the gates of his own ruin. Each trip to town for supplies was an exercise in nerve-shredding tension. He would go to the general store, his list clutched in his hand, oats, flour, a small tin of salve, and feel the weight of every gaze. The town was a viper's nest of gossip and suspicion. He could hear his name whispered behind cupped hands. Elias Thorne. Ain't been right since Martha passed. Buys more food than one man needs, don't he? He would pay for his goods, his face a mask of grim indifference, and hurry back to the sanctuary of his farm, his heart pounding until the barn was once more in sight. The danger was not an abstract concept. It was a living, breathing thing. He overheard a conversation between 2 farmers near the feed store that chilled him to the bone. They were talking about Abernathy, the plantation owner. He wasn't just offering a reward. He had hired men, trackers with dogs, to hunt for his property. The men spoke of it casually, as if discussing the weather or crop prices, their callousness a stark reminder of the world these children had fled. Elias realized the children weren't just runaways escaping hard labor. They were in mortal danger. If found, their fate would be unspeakable. This knowledge sharpened his resolve. The risk he was taking was no longer a vague notion of trouble with the law. It was a choice between life and death for the 5 souls hidden in his barn. By night, the barn transformed. Under the soft glow of a single lantern, it became a temporary home. He would bring them their meal, and they would eat together in a comfortable silence. He tended to the little girl, whose name he learned was Sarah. He applied the salve to a cut on her leg, his large, clumsy hands surprisingly gentle. He listened as they began to speak, their voices soft and hesitant at first, then growing stronger in the safety of the shadows. He learned their names: Samuel, the protector; Caleb, his quiet younger brother; Sarah and Mary, the 2 little girls; and Benjamin, the youngest, a boy of 5 who still clutched a small, hand-carved wooden bird. They didn't tell him where they came from, or what they were running from. They didn't have to. The haunted look in their eyes told the story. But they told him other things. Samuel spoke of his father, a blacksmith who could make iron do anything he wanted. Caleb told him about his mother's singing. They were small, fractured memories of a life that had been stolen from them. Elias, in turn, found himself speaking of Martha. He told them how she could name every bird by its song, how she believed there was no such thing as a weed, only a flower in the wrong place. Talking about her, sharing her with them, did not deepen his grief. It alchemized it. It turned the leaden weight of her absence into a shimmering, gentle memory. He was keeping her alive, not by dying to join her, but by living out the kindness she had embodied. He was becoming the man Martha had always believed he could be. One evening, as a storm gathered on the horizon, flashing silent heat lightning in the distance, Benjamin, the youngest, crept close to him and held out the small wooden bird. "For you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Elias took the small, smooth object. It was crudely carved, but the shape was unmistakable. A sparrow. Small, common, but resilient. A survivor. He closed his hand around it, the wood warm from the boy's grasp. It was the first gift he had received in over a year. It was a token of trust, an anchor in the storm, and he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he could not just hide them. Hiding was temporary. Hiding was waiting to be found. He had to do more. He had to get them away. He had to get them to freedom, whatever the cost. The decision settled not with a crash, but with a quiet, solid finality. He couldn't keep them here. The farm was a fishbowl, and the whole town was tapping on the glass. The trackers Abernathy had hired would be methodical, relentless. They would work their way outward, farm by farm, and sooner or later, they would come to his door. And Sheriff Miller's suspicion was a seed that, once planted, would only grow. Hiding them was no longer an act of protection. It was merely delaying the inevitable. He had to get them north. He knew of a place, a network, whispered about in quiet corners. The Underground Railroad, they called it, though it was neither underground nor a railroad. It was a chain of brave souls, Quaker families and freedmen, who risked everything to help people escape the bondage of the South. His own great-uncle, a man his father had called a radical and a fool, had been a part of it before the war. Elias remembered hushed conversations, talk of a safe house 2 counties north, a farm with a red-painted well pump, a beacon of hope in the darkness. It was a long shot, a memory from childhood, but it was the only shot they had. He spent the next day preparing, his movements filled with a new, frantic energy. He fixed the axle on his old buckboard wagon, the screech of the unoiled wheels a sound he couldn't risk on a clandestine journey. He packed a crate with what food he had left, the rest of the canned peaches, a sack of potatoes, a small wheel of cheese he'd bought in town, praying no one had noticed the extravagance. He filled 2 large canteens with water. Every action was deliberate, every choice weighed against the risk. He had to create a false bottom in the wagon, a space large enough for 5 children to lie hidden, covered by empty grain sacks and old tarps. He worked through the day and into the night, the rhythmic sound of his hammer, and saw a prayer against the coming danger. That night he gathered them in the lantern light. He laid out the plan, his voice low and serious. He didn't sugarcoat the dangers. The journey would be long, close to 50 miles. They would have to travel by night and hide by day. They would be cramped, uncomfortable, and they would have to be absolutely silent if they were stopped. He looked at each of their faces, seeing the fear there, but also a dawning ember of hope. For the first time, they were not just running from something. They were running toward something. Samuel, ever the protector, asked the hard questions. "How do you know we can trust these people? This place?" Elias looked at the boy, and for the first time he told them a piece of his own story. He told them about his great-uncle, the radical, the man who believed that no man could own another. He didn't tell them about his father, or about Josiah's farm, or about the shame he carried. He hadn't earned that level of confession, but he told them enough. He told them that his own blood had once flowed in the service of this cause, and that he was now, finally, trying to honor it. It was enough. They would leave the next night. The final 24 hours were the longest of Elias's life. The air was thick with a palpable tension, a sense of an ending for better or worse. He found himself looking at his farm, at the barn, at the house, as if for the last time. He felt a strange detachment, as if he were already a ghost here. This place of his birth, this vessel of his grief, was no longer his home. His home for now was a rickety wagon and the 5 precious lives it would carry. As darkness fell on the final day, he stood on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and red. It looked like the world was on fire. He thought of Martha, of her simple courage. He thought of the rope, lying dormant in the corner of the barn. He had been so ready to leave this world. Now he was about to journey into its most dangerous corners, all for a whisper he had almost missed. He went back inside and picked up the small wooden sparrow Benjamin had given him. He slipped it into his pocket. It felt solid, real, a promise. The night was moonless, a thick blanket of clouds smothering the stars. It was a gift. Darkness was their ally. Elias led the old horse from its stall, its hooves muffled by the soft dirt of the barn floor. He hitched it to the buckboard wagon, his movements practiced and quiet. Inside the barn, the children were ready, their few meager belongings bundled in scraps of cloth. Sarah, her cough now quieted, held tightly to Samuel's hand. Benjamin clutched his wooden bird, a twin to the one in Elias's pocket. Their faces were tense in the lantern light, a mixture of fear and fragile excitement. Elias helped them into the wagon, arranging them in the cramped space he had built beneath the false floor. "Remember," he whispered, his voice a low rasp. "No matter what you hear, no matter what happens, you do not make a sound. Not a single sound. Do you understand?" 5 silent nods in the darkness. He covered them with the grain sacks, then threw a dusty tarp over the top, arranging a few empty crates to complete the illusion. To any casual observer, it was just a farmer hauling goods. He took one last look around the barn. The place where he had meant to die had become the place where he had chosen to live. He blew out the lantern, plunging them into absolute blackness. He climbed onto the driver's seat, the wood groaning under his weight. He clicked the reins, and the wagon lurched forward, the wheels rolling silently out of the barn and onto the dirt track that led away from the farm, away from the past. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of an owl, sent a jolt of fear through him. The road stretched before them, a pale, ghostly ribbon in the dark. They moved at a slow, steady pace, the rhythmic clopping of the horse's hooves the only sound in the world. An hour passed, then 2. His farm disappeared behind them, swallowed by the night. He was adrift, a man without a home, his only compass a childhood memory of a red-painted well. Around 3 a.m. he saw it, a flickering light up ahead, a checkpoint. His blood ran cold. 2 men on horseback, holding lanterns, their silhouettes stark against the dark trees. Trackers, or a posse organized by the sheriff. There was no way around them. He had to go through. He pulled on the reins, slowing the horse to a calm walk, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He prayed the children had remembered his warning. His own fear was a physical thing, a sour taste in his mouth, but he forced his face into a mask of weary indifference. One of the riders trotted forward, raising his lantern. The light blinded Elias for a moment. It was a deputy he recognized, a young, eager man named Calloway. "That's far enough, Thorne," Calloway called out, his voice holding the artificial authority of a man uncomfortable with his power. "What's your business out on the road at this hour?" Elias forced a calm he did not feel. "Evening, deputy, just heading to the mill at Stone Creek. Got to get there before the crowds, or you wait all day." It was a plausible lie. The mill opened early. Calloway's eyes swept over the wagon, lingering on the tarp and crates. "What you haulin'?" "Just some empty grain sacks to be filled, a few tools that need mending at the smithy." Beneath his feet, Elias could feel the slightest vibration, the barest hint of movement. He pressed his heels down, a silent command to be still. His entire body was rigid with tension. The deputy dismounted and walked closer, his lantern held high. He poked at a crate with the toe of his boot. He reached out and grabbed a corner of the tarp. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked, but it was not a question. This was it. The world stopped. In that moment, Elias felt a strange calm descend. He had come too far to fail now. He met the deputy's gaze, his own eyes hard as stone. "You think I'm lying to you, son?" he said, his voice dangerously low. "You think I'm out here in the dead of night for my health?" Just then, The horse, spooked by the lantern or sensing Elias's tension, shifted and snorted loudly. The sound broke the spell. The deputy, Calloway, took a half-step back, his hand instinctively going to his sidearm before he realized it was just the horse. He seemed embarrassed, young. He looked from Elias's hard face back to the wagon, then to his partner, who shrugged. "All right, Thorne," Calloway said, his bravado gone. "Go on. But be careful. There's trouble out tonight." Elias didn't wait for him to change his mind. He flicked the reins, and the wagon rolled forward, past the lanterns, past the danger, and back into the forgiving darkness. He didn't look back. He didn't breathe until they were a mile down the road. Under the tarp, 5 small bodies remained perfectly, miraculously still. They had passed through the fire.